At around 4 in the morning on June 25, 1950, artillery fire shattered the darkness along the 38th parallel. North Korean forces moved south in strength. Soldiers crossed the dividing line at multiple points. Tanks rolled toward Seoul. Fighting erupted around Kaesong, the Ongjin Peninsula, Chuncheon, and the eastern coast. Within days, Seoul would fall. Within weeks, American troops would be fighting in Korea. Soon, soldiers from more than a dozen nations would be drawn into a war that threatened to become something even larger. This is the moment most histories identify as the beginning of the Korean War, June 25, 1950. And in one important sense, that is correct. The attack that morning transformed the Korean conflict into a full-scale conventional war. But there is a problem with beginning the story there, because when North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel, Korea was not a peaceful country suddenly attacked by an enemy that had appeared from nowhere. Koreans had already been killing Koreans. Villages had already burned. Guerrillas were already fighting in the mountains. Soldiers had already rebelled against their own government. Troops from north and south had already exchanged fire along the border. And the line they were fighting over had existed for less than 5 years. To understand why Korea exploded in 1950, we have to go back to the moment when there was no North Korea and no South Korea, only Korea, and to a line on a map that was never supposed to become a permanent border. For 35 years, Korea had been under Japanese colonial rule. Japan formally annexed the peninsula in 1910, ending Korea's sovereignty and placing millions of Koreans under an imperial system that sought to control politics, land, education, labor, and eventually even cultural identity. Resistance never completely disappeared. Korean independence activists operated both inside and outside the peninsula. Some organized politically, some fought as guerrillas, others appealed to foreign governments for recognition. During the Second World War, the future of Korea became part of Allied discussions about what would happen after Japan was defeated. At the Cairo Conference in 1943, the United States, Britain, and China declared that Korea would, in due course, become free and independent. For Koreans who had lived for decades under colonial rule, independence was the dream. Then, in August 1945, Japan's empire suddenly collapsed. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and attacked Japanese forces in Manchuria. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. Across Korea, there was celebration. Japanese rule was ending. For many Koreans, this should have been the beginning of national freedom. Instead, it became the beginning of division. The Soviet army was already moving rapidly through Northeast Asia. American forces were much farther away. Washington now faced an urgent military problem. Who would accept the surrender of Japanese forces in Korea? And how far south would Soviet troops advance before American soldiers could arrive? During emergency meetings in Washington, American officials searched for a practical dividing line. 2 Army colonels, Charles Bonesteel and Dean Rusk, were asked to produce a proposal. They did not have months to negotiate Korea's political future. They had hours to solve an immediate military problem. Looking at a map, they recommended the 38th parallel. The line divided the peninsula roughly in half while keeping Seoul, Korea's historic capital, inside the American zone. Even Dean Rusk later remembered being surprised that the Soviet Union accepted the proposal. Japanese troops north of the line would surrender to Soviet forces. Japanese troops south of it would surrender to American forces. That was the original purpose of the division. It was an operational arrangement for accepting surrender. It was not presented as the permanent international border between 2 future Korean countries. There was no Republic of Korea. There was no Democratic People's Republic of Korea. There was certainly no agreement by the Korean people to split their country in 2. Yet one of the most important borders of the Cold War had just appeared on a map. Soviet forces entered northern Korea in August. American troops landed in the south in September. On paper, Korea was still one nation temporarily occupied in two military zones. On the ground, the reality began changing almost immediately. The problem was not simply that American soldiers stood in the south while Soviet soldiers stood in the north. Each occupation zone began developing its own political system, and communication across the 38th parallel became increasingly difficult. Road traffic was disrupted, railways were interrupted, trade suffered. Families found themselves on opposite sides. People crossing between zones encountered new restrictions. By November 1945, American officials were already warning Washington that the 38th parallel had, in practice, become a closed border, and that normal Korean national life was being severely disrupted. A line designed as a temporary military convenience was beginning to behave like a frontier. And on either side of that frontier, Korea's political future was being fought over. In the north, Soviet authorities worked with Korean communists and local people's committees. Land reform redistributed property. Major industries were brought under state control. Political opposition was gradually restricted, and among the figures rising within this new system was a young guerrilla veteran named Kim Il-sung. He had fought against Japanese rule and spent time in the Soviet Union. With Soviet support, his political position became increasingly powerful. In the South, the situation was different, but no less turbulent. The United States Army military government took control of administration. Lieutenant General John Hodge became one of the Central American figures in occupied Korea. But the Americans entered a society already filled with Korean political organizations competing to shape the new country. There were communists, socialists, moderates, conservatives, nationalists, former independence activists, and Koreans associated, willingly or unwillingly, with institutions from the Japanese colonial period. Among the returning nationalist leaders was Syngman Rhee. Rhee had spent decades involved in the independence movement, much of that time outside Korea. He was fiercely anti-communist and increasingly convinced that waiting indefinitely for cooperation with the Soviet-controlled North could prevent the South from forming a government of its own. This was the central problem. Almost everyone spoke of one Korea, but they increasingly disagreed about what that Korea should look like and who should control it. The Allies attempted to find an answer. In December 1945, the foreign ministers of the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain met in Moscow. The agreement called for the creation of a provisional Korean democratic government and contemplated a period of international trusteeship. The word trusteeship created outrage among many Koreans. After decades of Japanese colonialism, the idea that independence might again be delayed under foreign supervision was deeply unpopular. Political factions mobilized either for or against the proposal. Meanwhile, American and Soviet representatives created a joint commission intended to help establish a unified Korean government. It met in 1946. It failed. It met again in 1947. It failed again. The two sides could not agree on fundamental political questions, including which Korean organizations should participate in consultations. The Cold War was hardening across the world. Germany was becoming divided. Eastern Europe was falling under communist governments backed by Moscow. Washington was adopting containment, and Korea was becoming another place where compromise between the United States and Soviet Union was increasingly difficult. The longer negotiations failed, the more permanent Korea's supposedly temporary division became. Eventually, the United States referred the Korean question to the United Nations. The UN created a temporary commission on Korea and called for elections. But Soviet authorities did not allow the commission to operate in the northern zone. That created an impossible question. How do you organize an election for all Korea when observers cannot enter half the country? The answer was to proceed where access was possible. Elections were scheduled in the South for May 10, 1948. The United Nations Commission later concluded that the results represented the free will of voters in the areas accessible to it, areas containing roughly 2/3 of Korea's population. But many Koreans opposed the election precisely because it was not nationwide. They feared it would make division permanent. And nowhere was that fear about to become more violent than on the island of Jeju. Jeju lies off Korea's southern coast. Today it is known around the world for its natural beauty. But in the years after liberation, the island became one of the darkest examples of how far Korea's internal conflict had already progressed before 1950. Tension had been growing for months. On March 1, 1947, police fired during demonstrations on Jeju, killing civilians. The shootings intensified anger. Strikes and arrests followed. Political polarization deepened. Left-wing organizations gained support among sections of the population. Police repression intensified. Anti-communist groups from the mainland also became involved. Then, on April 3, 1948, armed rebels associated with the South Korean Labor Party attacked police stations and right-wing targets across the island. The uprising had begun. The rebels opposed the political order emerging in the South, and particularly the separate elections scheduled for May. Authorities responded with counterinsurgency operations. Violence escalated. Government forces, police, anti-communist groups, armed insurgents and civilians became trapped inside an increasingly brutal conflict. After the Republic of Korea was established, repression intensified further. Entire communities in the mountainous interior were treated with suspicion. Villages were evacuated and destroyed. Suspected guerrillas and suspected supporters were hunted. People disappeared into detention. Others were killed without meaningful legal process. The Jeju 4.3 investigation report later estimated the total number of deaths connected to the broader period of violence at somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000. The victims included combatants. But enormous numbers were civilians. Children died, women died, elderly people died, and the violence would continue in different forms even after 1950. This was not yet the Korean War as the world would come to know it. There were no North Korean tank columns racing toward Busan. There were no American jet aircraft overhead. There were no Chinese armies crossing the Yalu. But the political struggle over Korea's future had already become armed, organized, and extraordinarily deadly. And while Jeju burned, the political division of Korea moved closer to becoming official. On May 10, 1948, elections were held in the South. A new National Assembly was formed. A constitution followed. On August 15th, the Republic of Korea was formally inaugurated in Seoul with Syngman Rhee as president. The South now had a government claiming authority as the legitimate government of Korea. Less than a month later, the North answered. On September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed in Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung became premier. It also claimed legitimacy over the entire Korean peninsula. Think about what had happened in only 3 years. In August 1945, there had been one Korea under Japanese rule. The 38th parallel had been selected to organize Japan's surrender. By September 1948, that line separated two governments, two political systems, two security structures, two emerging armies, and two rival leaderships, neither accepting permanent division as Korea's future. The temporary line had become something far more dangerous, and almost immediately, the instability inside the South produced another shock. In October 1948, the government prepared to send elements of the 14th Regiment stationed at Yeosu to help suppress the continuing uprising on Jeju. Some soldiers refused. On October 19th, roughly 2,000 men became involved in the rebellion. The mutineers seized Yeosu and moved into nearby Suncheon. Some local left-wing organizations emerged from underground. Police officers and right-wing figures were targeted. Government forces were rushed toward the region. They retook the major towns within days. But suppression brought another cycle of violence. Civilians suspected of helping the rebels were arrested. People were killed in retaliatory actions. Others fled into surrounding mountains, where some joined guerrilla forces. The Yeosu Suncheon Rebellion exposed something frightening about the new Republic of Korea. The ideological struggle was not simply located somewhere beyond the 38th parallel. It existed within the South. It existed within communities. It existed inside political organizations, and now it existed inside the military itself. By the end of 1948, Korea had two governments, internal insurgencies, guerrillas and armed forces, facing each other across a border neither side truly accepted. Then came 1949. This is one of the most important years in the hidden beginning of the Korean War, because the image of a peaceful frontier becomes impossible to maintain. The 38th parallel was not quiet. There were patrol clashes, cross-border raids, defections, infiltrations, exchanges of gunfire, and increasingly serious confrontations involving larger units. American diplomatic reporting from Korea in June 1949 described incidents as occurring daily along the parallel. Most were small, but some were not. Fighting around Kaesong became serious. On the Ongjin Peninsula, North Korean forces reportedly penetrated south of the parallel in battalion strength. Hundreds of soldiers could be involved in individual confrontations. American reports described a continuing war of nerves along the border. Another American intelligence report noted frequent minor forays by both sides. The distinction matters. It would be wrong to turn these clashes into a claim that South Korea secretly launched the Korean War. It would also be wrong to imagine the North and South simply waiting peacefully for June 1950. The frontier was unstable. Both Korean governments dreamed of reunification. Neither viewed the division as legitimate or permanent. Political rhetoric could be aggressive. Military commanders tested positions. One incident could provoke another. In June 1949, American planners were already studying what the United States should do if a full-scale invasion from North Korea actually occurred. That fact alone tells us how dangerous the situation had become. The occupation itself was also ending. Soviet combat forces withdrew from the north. Most American occupation troops withdrew from the south, although American advisors remained. For the first time since 1945, the armies facing each other around the 38th parallel were increasingly Korean armies. Behind them, however, stood two very different international relationships. North Korea had been built with extensive Soviet assistance. The Soviet Union supplied equipment, advisors, and training. South Korea depended heavily on American political, economic, and military support. But Washington and Moscow did not initially view another major war in Korea in exactly the same way. For Kim Il-sung, division was intolerable. He believed Korea could be reunified under his government. And he repeatedly sought Soviet approval for military action against the South. At first, Stalin was cautious. A war could provoke American intervention. It could become larger than Korea. But the strategic picture was changing rapidly. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists won the Chinese Civil War and established the People's Republic of China. The Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb. American forces had largely withdrawn from Korea, and Kim continued pressing his case. By the spring of 1950, Stalin's position changed. During Kim's visit to Moscow, the Soviet leader approved the idea of reunification by military means, although the available archival record makes clear that the initiative had been strongly pushed by Kim himself. Soviet assistance helped strengthen North Korea's military advantage. The North possessed tanks and heavier offensive capabilities that the South Korean forces could not easily match. Planning accelerated. And so we return to the darkness before dawn, on June 25, 1950. Except now the scene looks completely different. The artillery opening fire did not create the 38th parallel. The line had been drawn 5 years earlier. The soldiers moving south did not create rival Korean governments. Those had existed since 1948. The invasion did not introduce political violence to Korea. Jeju had already happened. Yeosu and Suncheon had already happened. Guerrilla warfare had already spread through parts of the south. The attack did not even bring the first military clashes to the 38th parallel. North and South Korean forces had already been exchanging fire there. But June 25 was still a decisive break. At around 4 in the morning, North Korean forces launched coordinated attacks across multiple sectors of the frontier. This was not another patrol confrontation, not another local border raid, not another guerrilla attack in the mountains. It was a large-scale invasion intended to destroy the South Korean government and reunify the peninsula under Pyongyang's control. North Korean forces rapidly broke through. Kaesong fell. Seoul was threatened almost immediately. President Ri's government faced disaster. And suddenly a Korean struggle that had been developing since 1945 became an international crisis. The United Nations Security Council condemned the attack. President Harry Truman decided that the United States would intervene. American aircraft entered the fighting. American ground forces followed. Other nations joined the United Nations command. Later, Chinese forces would intervene on the opposite side. Soviet pilots would secretly enter combat. What had begun with the hurried division of responsibility for a Japanese surrender was now one of the most dangerous wars of the Cold War. And that helps explain why June 25 became such a powerful historical dividing point. It provides a clean beginning. One morning, one invasion, one army crossing a line. Everything before June 1950 is harder to explain. There is no single villain standing alone at the beginning. There is Japanese colonial rule and the political world it left behind. There are Soviet and American occupation policies. There are Korean communists and anti-communists. There are nationalists who want unity, but violently disagree over its form. There are failed negotiations, foreign strategic interests, separate elections, two governments, police repression, insurgency, massacres, mutiny, guerrillas, border clashes, and ordinary Koreans repeatedly caught between forces larger than themselves. That complicated history is exactly why it matters. Because if we begin the Korean War only with tanks crossing the 38th parallel, the line itself appears almost natural, as though North Korea and South Korea had always existed. They had not. 5 years earlier, there was no international border there. A pair of American officers had helped select the parallel during an emergency planning session because Japan surrendered faster than Allied governments had prepared for. The line was supposed to help manage surrender and occupation. Then negotiations failed. Politics hardened. Foreign armies established different systems. Korean factions fought for control. Temporary institutions became permanent ones. The line grew thicker, first on maps, then at checkpoints, then in politics, then in military positions, and finally in blood. The deepest tragedy is that Koreans on both sides continued to speak about reunification. Division was widely considered unnatural, but the meaning of reunification became completely incompatible. To Syngman Rhee and his supporters, Korea should be united under an anti-communist republic centered in Seoul. To Kim Il-sung and his supporters, Korea should be united under the revolutionary system centered in Pyongyang. Both claimed Korea. Neither accepted the other Korean state as the legitimate final answer. So when the foreign occupation armies stepped back, they did not leave behind one country waiting to reunite. They left two governments preparing for a future in which only one might survive. On June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung attempted to decide that future by force. The invasion was real. The responsibility for launching that full-scale offensive is not erased by anything that happened before it. But neither should the 5 years before the invasion disappear. Because the Korean War did not emerge from an empty frontier on an otherwise peaceful peninsula. Its foundations had been laid through division, occupation, ideological conflict, failed diplomacy, internal rebellion, counterinsurgency, and repeated armed confrontation. June 25 was the beginning of the war the world remembers. But the hidden beginning came years earlier. In August 1945, in the confusion surrounding the collapse of an empire, inside a room in Washington, with a map of Korea and a line that was never supposed to become a permanent border,